Hello, my name is Dr. Finola Doyle O'Neill and I'm a broadcast historian at the School of History, UCC. I'm very interested in the trajectory of women's feminism and how we came to be where we are today. And it all starts really when women get the vote in 1918 in Ireland. And we women get the vote, but we have to be over 30 and we have to be women of property. And of course, this precluded a huge area of Catholic women who, as we know, were in the home at the time. So it isn't until years later that women in 1928 actually under 21 get the vote and they don't have to be propertied. The 1922 constitution was full of equality and it was imbued with a lot of the rhetoric of 1916 from Padraig Pearse, and of course James Connolly was a feminist, was a latter-day feminist. And it was really sad then that some of those provisions were removed in 1937, and it was a case of putting women back in their box. But again, you have to acknowledge that there was very little opposition to Article 41.2 regarding women and their place in the home. The only people who argued against it were Hannah Shee Skeffington and her group of women who were involved in the Women's Graduate Association at the time. And it tells us a lot about society in 1937, that women were predominantly in the home. They saw nothing wrong with it. There was no contraception. There was large Catholic families, and they didn't see themselves as being anything other than homemakers. And of course, the marriage bar would have definitely concretized that. They didn't really have any option. So you had to choose between marriage or a professional life. They really were incompatible, and they were extraordinary retrograde steps to take. The first female minister was obviously Countess Markievicz, and she had been very much involved in the suffrage movement, and she was also involved in the soup kitchens way back in 1913. So she was a woman of great status. She came from a huge Lissadil estate, and one wonders what a woman such as Countess Markievicz was doing, involving herself with the suffrage movement. But she was very, very involved, and she so became the first minister in 1919. And sadly, we don't see our second minister for 60 years later, and that's Maura Geoghegan Quinn in 1979. But let me just talk to you very briefly about maybe the heyday of Irish feminism, which was the 1970s. And that's where we get a lot of our rights, which we have now. So, for example, women couldn't sit on juries. In 1927, it was decreed that women would be too difficult, it would be too sort of awkward for women to sit on juries. So it wasn't until 1973 that women were allowed to sit on juries. And that's a really important part as well, because women have to be part of the process, of judicial process, that we have to be part of that whole system. But a very important thing happened also in the 70s. We joined the EC. And we must never forget that Europe has been very important for the empowerment of women, because many of the acts that were enacted in the 1970s, the Equal Pay Act of 1977, us having to introduce, for example, contraception in 1979, all of these things were really dictated to us by Europe. So being part of the EU has been hugely important for women's empowerment. And I suppose we have a very litigated constitution anyway, that we know, for example, when we bring it right up to 2018, repealing the 8th, that women have been very, very active in ensuring their rights. So 1977, you have the Employment Equality Act, which was updated in 1998. And that's really important for women because it removes gender bias, it removes all sort of conditions, equal pay is introduced, and it's really, really important. And again, dictated to by Europe. It was decided that there was anti-discrimination laws prevailing in Ireland regarding women's pay and women's status in the workplace. But I think possibly one of the most both insidious and probably retrospective steps ever taken probably in Ireland was in 1932, they introduced what was called the marriage bar. And that meant when women got married, they had to give up their job. And this has been, I'm sure many people listening will have been victim of that. And many women feel that they didn't really ever reach their academic or professional potential because of this act. So this was only revoked for primary school teachers, the INTO, in 1958, and for the rest of the workforce in 1973. And I think what's really, I suppose, important to highlight is that it took really about 10 to 12 years before women went back into the workforce. And it was a very slow drip of women reintegrating themselves back into the life and the discourse of Irish life. Have reached, I suppose, with obviously a very seismic change in Irish life was, of course, the the presidential election of Mary Robinson in 1990, and subsequent to that then also Mary McAleese. And there's actually a very funny tale told by the journalist Stephanie Preisner, that when she was in primary school all the way through, that one of her male teachers said, this was in the 90s, he said, oh, perhaps one day I might be president. And they said, don't be so stupid, sir. There's only ever been a female president. So that would be a lovely way to be able to perceive life, to see that women, that can do attitude, the fact that we can surmount any barriers that we need to. So between getting the vote in 1918, obviously legalizing things such as maybe abortion, allowing women equal rights in the 70s, allowing women to be able to decide whether they want to take contraceptives or not. That was 1979, allowing women to sit on juries. That big, huge chasm between 1919 and the election of the first female Countess Markievicz the Dáil, right up to 1979, to bringing us all the way into the 90s, that first female president. It's really extraordinary. So all that remains now really is that we should have our first female Taoiseach. And it's interesting that in 2016 they introduced a quota system, and we had the highest level of females in the Dáil. 53 women in 2018 were Dáil deputies and senators, and there's a tremendous painting in the Oireachtas just depicting this great feat. But yet, amongst all of those, we still do not have a female Taoiseach. So there's still, as the Fianna Fáil manifesto used to say, still a lot to do, a lot done, but still a lot to do. And I think that really we must also value our older generation. We've an awful lot to learn from them, and particularly, as I said, women who were denied the opportunity to work in the workforce because of this ridiculous marriage bar. Women, it's very difficult now in the Local Government Act of 2014. Town councils were abolished, which meant that was an avenue for women to get into politics. That avenue has been removed somewhat. And being a councillor now is almost a full-time job with only half the pay. So it's become much more difficult for women to access politics. So if we do have to reach that goal of our first female Taoiseach, we need to reevaluate the way politics is done, how it needs to be balanced with women's lifestyle, because plus ça change, as they say, women are still the primary nurturers, women are still the primary carers. And until we see that balance and that way of perhaps enhancing the way that they can access politics and access public life, we will still have a very male-dominated society. Ivana Bacik, the senator, once said when she entered Dáil Éireann, the first thing she noticed was that most of the constituent people inside there were male, pale and stale. We hope to change that. So over the years, one can ask, what would we have done without Europe? How active have women been? There's a very famous saying by the very famous suffragette, Hannah Shees Geffington. She once said, "Ní saoirse go saoirse na man." There's no freedom without freeing women. And women, of course, are still struggling with the glass ceiling. Yes, we have rights for abortion. Yes, women have equal pay. But yet there's still women in the home. There's still women who need to be, I suppose, catered for, the work-life balance. And we know that, for example, currently the coronavirus has really impeded women both in terms of academically. Their output has literally shot down. People look around them and ask, where are all the women on NEFIT? Where are the voices of females? So we still have a big journey to go. But fortunately, we have all the legal instruments in place, but now we need to have that energy to be able to push a little bit further.